Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senator Cruz.
Texas. I spent all week in Washington, D.C., and it is great to be back in America. It was 6:30 a.m. The cold waves were crashing. The wind was blowing on the beaches below 100-foot sheer white cliffs. A spot called Point du Hoc, between two beaches codenamed Utah and Omaha. 200 young men under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, a Texan, landed on that beach. Many of them were young, many younger than the interns, the volunteers we see here at this convention. Many of them were scared. Their mission was to take out the Nazi howitzers atop that cliff. They were to climb the 100-foot cliffs with grappling hooks and daggers stuck into the rocks. A feat the Nazis were sure was impossible. Those young boys marched forward into machine gun fire, into danger. Just like 57 years later in New York City, the first responders on 9/11 marched forward into danger. It was 70 years ago today that those boys scaled that cliff. It was 70 years ago today that they took out those Nazi guns. And went on to win the war and liberate the world. $750,000 Americans fought in World War II, our greatest generation. Including the senior U.S. Congressman Ralph Hall, who served in World War II. $22,000 Texans gave their lives in World War II. And you know, Texans have always led the way in the fight for freedom. From Dwight D. Eisenhower to Rick Perry to Rand Paul. All good, principled men who have stood and fought for freedom. It's in our blood. It is who we are. It was in the fall of 1835 that the brave Texians in the city of Gonzales received a demand from General Santa Anna that they hand over their guns and they hand over the cannon that guarded the city. Come and take it. We all know the immortal Texas spirit that they erected in that flag that is an integral part of who we are. A picture of the cannon with the simple legend, come and take it. Today, liberty is under assault again. Like never before, our freedom is under assault. And let me tell you, again today, Texans will stand up and lead the fight to defend our freedom. This is a convention hall filled with patriots. Just like the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence and pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to restore the American dream, we choose freedom. Number one, we need to defend the Constitution. The Constitution, the most extraordinary document crafted in the history of the world other than the Bible. A document designed, as Thomas Jefferson said, to bind the mischief of government. There's a whole lot of mischief in Washington right now. We need to defend the Bill of Rights, all of the Bill of Rights. We need to defend the First Amendment, the first foundational freedom in the Bill of Rights. Religious liberty today is under assault. The IRS is demanding of citizen groups, tell us what books you're reading. Tell us the content of your prayers. You know what? The federal government has no business asking any American the content of our prayers. We see the Obama administration right now litigating against the Little Sisters of the Poor, a Catholic convent of nuns who've taken a vow of poverty to care for the sick and elderly, and the federal government is litigating against them, trying to take away their religious freedom and to fine them millions of dollars to force these nuns to pay for abortion-inducing drugs of others. Let me give you a simple rule of thumb. If you're litigating against nuns, you've probably done something wrong. We need to defend the Second Amendment. I agree with Justice Joseph Story that the right to keep and bear arms is the palladium of the rights of the Republic. And in the great state of Texas, gun control means hitting what you aim at. We need to defend the Fourth and Fifth Amendments and our right to privacy. How many of y'all have your cell phones here today? Let me ask you, please, leave your cell phones on. I want to make sure President Obama hears every word we have to say today. We need to defend the 10th Amendment. Or as President Obama calls it, the what? The 10th Amendment, the basic protection that limits the authority of the federal government and says that sovereignty resides in the states and ultimately with we the people. The powers of the federal government, as our framers put it, are few and defined. We need to defend our nation from threats foreign and abroad. We need to secure the borders. But there are a host of areas where the federal government has no constitutional authority to intrude its nose. For example, we need to repeal Common Core. Education is too important to let it be governed by bureaucrats out of Washington, D.C. It needs to be at the state level, or even better, at the local level, where parents can have direct influence over the education of our kids. And besides, we already have a Common Core in this country. It's called the Constitution of the United States. Number two, we need to restore American leadership in the world. I agree with President Reagan that America believes in peace through strength. All across this country, our hearts have been breaking as we've seen America recede from leadership in the world. It's created a vacuum into which have stepped nations like Iran and Russia and China, and the world has become a much more dangerous place. When bullies and tyrants are laughing at America, that's not the American tradition. That's not the American spirit. That is not who we are. To restore the American dream, we choose freedom. Yes. There was a time when we had another president, like President Obama. We had Jimmy Carter in the White House. By the way, if there's one person thrilled at the job President Obama's doing, it's Jimmy Carter. And all of us remember how quickly things can change. President Reagan came in to office fueled by the Reagan Revolution, fueled by millions of men and women across this country. And President Reagan stood up on the world stage and he said, the Soviet Union is an evil empire. He said Marxism-Leninism will end up on the ash heap of history. He was asked, what's your strategy for the Cold War? He said, it's very simple. We win, they lose. Now, all of the intelligentsia, all of the cognoscenti, they tittered at such uneducated Philistine views. He didn't have the sophistication. He didn't have the nuance. He didn't understand détente, which I'm pretty sure is French for surrender. But Ronald Wilson Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate and uttered the most important words uttered by any leader in modern times when he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." A couple of weeks ago, I was in Israel, and I had the opportunity to visit with famed Soviet dissident Natan Sharansky. Spent 9 years in the Soviet Gulag. Sharansky described how the prisoners in the Gulag would pass notes from cell to cell. Did you hear what President Reagan said? Tear down this wall. The leadership of America reverberates across the globe. And we need to bring it back. We need to stand with Israel. We need to make clear that we will no longer play footsie with the mullahs of Iran, and we will not allow them to acquire nuclear weapon capability. A couple of months ago, we remember the government of Iran named as their ambassador to the United Nations Hamid Abu-Dhabi, a known terrorist who participated in holding Americans hostage for 444 days. When that happened, I was proud to introduce legislation barring the admission of Abu-Dhabi to America. That legislation passed the United States Senate 100-0. It received praise from senators as varied as Lindsey Graham and Chuck Schumer. I have to admit, I went up to Schumer afterwards. I said, "Chuck, be careful. Lightning's going to strike you." It then passed the House of Representatives 435-0. And then President Obama signed it into law. A couple of weeks ago at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, President Obama was joking about this. He said, "So Ted Cruz introduced some legislation that I signed. Here's a picture of the signing ceremony." And he had a picture of himself, of me, and the devil in hell freezing over. But it was one example of what can happen when we come together and stand for freedom and stand against tyranny and oppression and the rabid anti-Americanism of the government of Iran. We should be speaking up for dissidents suffering right now. We should be speaking up for Pastor Saeed Abedini. Pastor Saeed is an American citizen who is languishing in an Iranian prison because he was sentenced to 8 years prison time for professing his Christian faith. His wife and his 2 small children live in Idaho, praying for their husband, Pastor Saeed. And let me tell you, God works in incredible ways. Do you know that in the time Pastor Saeed has been in that prison, he has led dozens of his fellow captors and his jailers to Christ? But rather than making deals with the Taliban to let terrorists go, we should be saying, "Bring Pastor Saeed home." We should be speaking out for Miriam Ibrahim. Miriam is a young mother, married to a man from New Hampshire. She has a little boy who's a toddler, and just a few weeks ago, she gave birth to a precious little girl. Where did she give birth? In a prison cell in Sudan. She has been sentenced to die. She has been sentenced to receive 100 lashes and then be hung by the neck till dead, unless she renounces her Christian faith. And Miriam has said, I will not renounce Christ. Let me ask a simple question. Where is the President of the United States? Why isn't the President of the United States standing up on the world stage and saying, free Miriam Ibrahim right now? Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. An Iranian prison, Sudanese prison, tear down these prison walls. Bring our Americans home. The third and final thing we need to do is we need to bring back jobs and economic growth. In the year and a half I have had the honor of representing you in the U.S. Senate, my number one priority has been fighting to bring back jobs and economic growth. It is foundational to everything else. If you want to turn around unemployment, if you want to turn around our national debt, if you want to rebuild our military and defend our national security, we've got to have growth. For 5 years, we have been trapped in the great stagnation. 1.6 trillion in new taxes on small businesses, crushing regulations. And who's been hurt the most by the Obama economy? It's the people who are struggling. It's young people. It's Hispanics. It's African Americans. It's single moms. You know, a few weeks ago, I was up in Nebraska at a rally in North Platte, Nebraska. 1,000 people gathered in the countryside of Nebraska. And a single mom came up to me, a young woman. She hugged my neck. She said, Ted, I've got 6 kids at home. My husband has left me. He won't pay child support. She said, I'm working 5 jobs. None of them are even 30 hours a week because of Obamacare. I'm having a hard time putting food on the table. I'm having a hard time keeping clothes on my children's back. And I never get to see my kids, and they need their mother. That's who's being hurt by what we're doing now. How do we turn that around? We get back to the free market principles that have made the American free enterprise system the greatest engine for freedom and prosperity the world has ever seen. We unleash the American energy renaissance that's creating millions of high-paying jobs. We audit the Federal Reserve. We abolish the IRS. And we repeal every blessed word of Obamacare. Something incredible is happening. Something is sweeping the state of Texas. It is sweeping every state in the Union. In 1980, we saw the Reagan Revolution. We saw, in the face of stagnation, in the face of feckless and naive foreign policy, in the face of America getting weaker and weaker, we saw a grassroots movement that turned this country around and said, get back to the basic principles that built this nation into the greatest nation in the history of the world. That same thing is happening today. Every one of you who had your cell phones, I would ask you to take them out and text the word growth to the number 33733. Once again, that's growth to 33733. Why? Because what we're doing is we're building a grassroots army in Texas and all across this country of men and women who are saying, we will not go quietly into the night. We will not give up on the United States of America. We want our freedom back. It won't come from Washington. In 1980, Washington, D.C. despised Ronald Reagan. The only way we turn this country around is the American people. The only way we turn this country around is each of you on the phone, on email, on Facebook, on Twitter, reaching out to your friends and family and neighbors and saying, bring back the principles that made our nation strong. Bring back freedom, bring back opportunity. You know, a great many of you have gotten to know my father, Pastor Raphael Cruz. It was 57 years ago that he fled Cuba, bloodied, beaten, tortured, in prison, but coming to America seeking freedom. I'll tell you what my father has said over and over again. I lost my freedom once, and I'll die before it happens again. That's why we're here. What is happening here is happening all over this country. Millions of men and women, many of whom have never been involved in politics, are waking up. They're looking around. They're saying, what's happening to this country? It's getting harder and harder for working class men and women to provide for their families. The rich keep getting richer, and everyone else gets left behind. Those with power and influence in Washington, those that have stroke in the corrupt, bipartisan cabal of power in Washington get richer and richer and richer, and everyone else in the country gets left behind. Millions of Americans who have been going to work, going to church, and raising their kids are waking up and saying, what is happening to this nation? We need to get back to basic free market principles. We need to get back to American leadership. We need to get back to liberty. We need to get back to the Constitution. As President Reagan famously put it, liberty is not passed down on the bloodstream from one generation to the next. Every generation must stand and fight to defend liberty, or one day we will answer to our children and our children's children. What was it like when America is free? The men and women in this room, mark my words, will never have to answer that question. Because Texans have led the way defending freedom, and to restore the American dream, we together choose freedom. Thank you, and God bless you.